In the mid-1940s, the position of the British aircraft manufacturer Supermarine seemed absolutely unshakable. Their signature aircraft, the famous single-seat Spitfire fighter, had performed brilliantly in combat during World War II. The fighter was incredibly successful in both its standard land-based version and as a carrier-based variant. The company boasted a highly skilled workforce. Their engineers could always draw on a massive amount of operational experience with their aircraft. Supermarine constantly kept its finger on the pulse of the latest aviation design trends, and they actively invested in developing ambitious new projects. The earliest mentions of the company developing a jet fighter actually surfaced back in June 1942. That's when they pitched the military a concept for a completely new aircraft called the Jet Spitfire. Basically, it was a bold hybrid. They combined the familiar wing from the classic Spitfire with a brand new fuselage. This fuselage housed a de Havilland H-1 jet engine. But at the time, the military wasn't really impressed with the idea. They were much more focused on rapidly ramping up production of their existing combat-proven fighters and upgrading them. Most importantly, they wanted to maintain parity with the latest German fighters coming from Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf. Meanwhile, the development of piston-engine Spitfires showed no signs of slowing down. The next leap in this legendary airplane's evolution happened when engineers worked closely with top British research centers. Together, they developed a new wing with a laminar flow airfoil. This innovation promised a major boost in top speed, a modified Spitfire. Mark 14 fighter equipped with this wing was given its own name, the Spiteful. It first took to the skies in June 1944. Right alongside it, they were also developing a carrier-based version specifically for the Navy, which they called the Sea Fang. Traditionally, the beating heart of these aircraft had been a Rolls-Royce engine, and when that engine-building giant started actively working on jet engines, the team at Supermarine took immediate notice. In early 1944, a development team led by chief designer Joseph Smith started preliminary research for a completely new jet aircraft. At first, they planned to power it with the promising RB-40 turbojet engine. But engineering calculations quickly showed that an effective fighter needed an engine with a much smaller diameter. They also needed to get their hands on one as fast as possible. That's when Rolls-Royce stepped in with a great alternative. It was the RB-41 engine, which produced 2,998 pounds of thrust. This engine later became known as the Nene. In fact, the history of the world-famous Nene engine traces its roots directly back to the development program for this British fighter. Official development of the new jet aircraft kicked off in the summer of 1944. This was to meet the latest requirements from the Royal Air Force. Because the company had the foresight to do extensive research ahead of time, the preliminary design for the new airplane was ready in just a matter of days. The fighter inherited the rugged, all-metal tapered wing from the Spiteful, complete with flaps and specialized ailerons. But the engine was now housed inside a brand new, all-metal fuselage. Fixed air intakes were positioned on either side of the pressurized cockpit. The cockpit itself was covered by a clear bubble canopy, giving the pilot excellent visibility. This closely resembled the later versions of the piston-engine Spitfires. Interestingly, at first, they didn't even consider installing an ejection seat. To make it easier for mechanics to service the engine, the entire upper section of the fuselage was removable. An extended exhaust pipe was routed straight through the tail section of the airplane. The aircraft itself kept a conventional tail assembly and a traditional tailwheel landing gear. True to their conservative nature, the British designers deliberately passed on a modern tricycle gear. They figured a three-point landing would be much more familiar to the pilots of the day, and as a bonus, it let them keep the main landing gear struts completely unchanged. Fuel was stored in tanks inside the fuselage and wings, giving it a pretty hefty total capacity of 474 imperial gallons. As for the armament, they brought it over from its predecessor without a single change. Each wing housed two powerful 20mm cannons. By August 1944, Supermarine had secured an official contract to build the first 3 prototypes of this ambitious project. The engineers internally dubbed the aircraft the Jet Spiteful. That's exactly how the journey began for an aircraft destined to kick off a whole new era in British military aviation history. On November 23rd, the Central Fighter Establishment carried out a detailed inspection of the new fighter's mock-up. After looking it over carefully, the board came back with a list of requested changes. Some of their suggestions were actually pretty major. For instance, the brass really wanted to see a modern tricycle landing gear. They also wanted the guns moved from the wings directly into the fuselage. But the designers decided to flat out ignore these completely reasonable and logical requests. Supermarine stubbornly stuck to the idea of keeping the new airframe as close to their older models as possible, all to simplify future mass production. Despite these disagreements, design work pressed right on. In fact, by January 1945, the project was even granted priority status. Come February, an updated set of specifications for the fighter was issued. They clearly laid out the following performance targets: a top speed of roughly 480 knots at an altitude of 30,000 feet. The airplane's service ceiling was set at 45,000 feet, and its rate of climb was supposed to hit 5,000 feet per minute. It's worth pointing out an interesting detail here. At this stage, the top brass wasn't even thinking about building a carrier-capable fighter for the Navy. So all the development work was aimed strictly at the Royal Air Force. On July 9th, an ambitious contract was awarded to build 24 pre-production jets based on the Spiteful. The scope was huge. 6 of these aircraft were supposed to be standard land-based fighters, while the other 18 were going to be navalized for carrier operations. On top of that, they wanted to split the naval batch right down the middle. Half of them would feature fixed wings, and the other half would get folding wings to save precious hangar space on the carriers. But skipping ahead for a moment, these grand plans just never materialized. In February 1946, that entire contract was suddenly canceled. Instead, by March 1948, the military ended up buying 18 de Havilland Sea Vampire F-20 fighters. Those planes made history as the first production jet fighters to enter service with the Royal Navy. Back in September 1945, engineers decided to modify a couple of the prototypes. They fitted them with arresting hooks, beefed up the landing gear struts, and added speed brakes to the upper wing surfaces. By that point, test flights of the basic piston engine Spiteful had already revealed a major flaw. Thanks to its unforgiving laminar flow wing, the aircraft was incredibly unstable and tough to handle at low speeds. For a plane expected to safely trap on a short carrier deck, that was a deal-breaker. Despite the red flags, Supermarine stubbornly pushed ahead with developing their jet-powered Spiteful. On July 27, 1946, test pilot Jeffrey Quill took the first prototype up for its maiden flight. He flew it from the Boscombe Down test facility. By then, designers had significantly upgraded the Nene engine. This pushed it to nearly 4,500 pounds of thrust, but they ran into unexpected issues right out of the gate. The jet exhaust was angled downwards and aft. Just taxiing around made it obvious that operating a jet-powered taildragger from grass or unpaved strips was going to be a nightmare. Once in the air, Quill discovered serious directional stability issues too. As it turned out, the engineers had simply undersized the vertical stabilizer. The second prototype was flown by Mike Lithgow. It did not get off the ground until nearly a year later, on June 17, 1947. This version was built as a proper carrier-based fighter. It featured a modified tail and flaps, increased fuel capacity, and an in-house Supermarine ejection seat. On top of that, it was powered by an uprated Nene 2 engine. This power plant put out around 5,000 pounds of thrust. But once again, the test results were a letdown. The climb rate was still abysmal. Also, the old directional stability issues had not gone away. The aircraft was constantly yawing in flight. Because of this, tracking a target and firing the guns accurately would be nearly impossible. Mike Lithgow made the fighter's historic first carrier landing aboard HMS Illustrious. This event took place on October 15, 1947. By October 28th, they had kicked off an intensive series of nearly 30 carrier launches and traps. Legendary test pilots Eric Brown and Stanley Orr also joined in on these risky trials. Following these grueling flights, engineers had to quickly stiffen the tailwheel shock strut. They also adjusted the angle of the tailhook so the jet could catch the arresting wires more reliably. Finally, to address the jet's notoriously short legs, they fitted a massive conformal belly tank under the fuselage. This tank held about 324 gallons of fuel. Royal Navy brass were growing increasingly disappointed with the jet's performance. Even so, testing pushed ahead without missing a beat. On February 26, 1948, Mike Lithgow took the controls of the first prototype. During this flight, he set a new world speed record. Flying a standard 100-kilometer closed circuit, he pushed the jet to an impressive 565 miles per hour, or about 490 knots. Shortly after, on March 31st, the fighter finally received its official name. It was called the Attacker. But during spring flight testing in 1948, another major issue emerged. When the aircraft was flying at low altitude near the speed of sound, aerodynamic loads on the elevator would suddenly spike to dangerous levels. This caused the aircraft to pitch down aggressively. It forced the jet into an uncommanded steep dive. Unfortunately, this instability soon led to tragedy. In June of that year, the second prototype crashed. This claimed the life of Royal Navy pilot John King Joyce. The exact cause of the crash was never fully established at the time. However, engineers strongly suspected violent in-flight oscillations. Furthermore, tests showed that the aircraft had terrible spin recovery characteristics. To resolve this and improve directional stability, designers decided to fit the aircraft with a dorsal fin. This was an aerodynamic fairing placed just ahead of the vertical stabilizer. Supermarine's management decided to press ahead. They began testing an entirely new swept wing on the third prototype. However, development dragged on. Because of this delay, the updated aircraft did not take to the skies until January 1950. Engineers had to rebuild the first prototype into a fully capable carrier variant just to keep the testing schedule on track. Additionally, a contract was signed for a fourth prototype. Its primary difference was the wing, which was shifted aft by about 13 inches. It also featured enlarged air intakes for improved engine cooling. Meanwhile, what was the situation for the Royal Navy? The competing Sea Vampire never truly caught on for carrier operations due to its low thrust and painfully short combat radius. As a result, the fleet was still flying aging piston engine fighters from the Second World War. Given the situation, the Attacker unexpectedly became the only viable modern alternative. Faced with no other options, and despite its known technical flaws, the British Admiralty placed an initial order for 63 aircraft. This took place in late October 1948. The production fighters were designated as the Attacker F Mark I. According to military doctrine, the new aircraft's primary roles were daytime interception, combat air patrol, and long-range strike operations. To ensure the fighter fit aboard aircraft carriers, it was equipped with folding wingtips. For pilot safety, it was fitted with a modern Martin Baker Mark 1A ejection seat. The first production aircraft successfully took to the skies on April 4, 1950. Just a month later, during a routine test flight, the pilot decided to evaluate the effectiveness of the speed brakes. During the third steep dive, as the airspeed approached 430 knots, a critical emergency occurred. The right wingtip suddenly folded uncommanded. Renowned British aviation historian Philip Birtles described the tense situation like this: the aircraft instantly and violently rolled to the right. However, by applying full left rudder, the pilot miraculously managed to somewhat maintain his altitude and heading. After bleeding off airspeed to around 270 knots, he made a risky decision. He was going to try and land the damaged fighter. Because the folded wingtip had completely jammed the ailerons, lateral control was incredibly difficult. After extending the landing gear, the pilot began a very wide left turn, controlling the aircraft using absolutely nothing but the rudder. The pilot was Leslie Richard Colquhoun, and he actually managed to limp the crippled fighter all the way back to South Marston. Incredibly, on short final, he even managed to drop the flaps, which seemed almost impossible. The aircraft touched down hard on the runway at roughly 200 knots, yawing wildly to the side. For the last 300 feet of the landing roll, a massive shower of sparks shot out from under the left main gear. The friction had completely shredded the tire, and the heavy fighter was skidding across the concrete left wing low. In the end, it miraculously came to a stop just 30 feet from the runway edge. For his incredible courage, composure, and superb airmanship, Leslie Richard Colquhoun was officially awarded the George Medal. In total, 43 baseline F Mark I fighters and another 16 FB Mark I fighter bombers were built for the Fleet Air Arm. The latter version packed some serious firepower. It featured underwing hardpoints for 2 1,000-pound bombs, along with 8 rails for unguided rockets, 4 on each wing. Interestingly, Those early production aircraft did not originally feature the stabilizing dorsal fin on the tail. Because of this, all of those jets eventually had to be sent back to the factory for a mandatory retrofit. The next, and ultimately most widely produced variant of the aircraft was the FB Mark II fighter bomber. Its key upgrades included a more powerful Rolls-Royce Nene 102 engine with an electric starter, along with a much improved sliding canopy. The armament, meanwhile, remained identical to its predecessor. They built 84 examples of this successful variant. The Royal Navy officially accepted the final airframe into service in March 1954. In early 1950, Supermarine's management decided to organize a major sales tour for their new Attacker jet fighter across the Near and Middle East. The goal was simple. They wanted to secure export orders. They carefully planned the route to take full advantage of Royal Air Force bases, as the RAF still maintained a strong military presence in the region back then. On May 19, 1950, test pilot Mike Lithgow was at the controls. The first prototype took off from the UK. It headed out on its long journey. The ground support crew followed closely behind in a Vickers Valletta transport. The new jet flew its first demonstration in Tunis. After some impressive flight displays at Libyan airfields, the British delegation arrived in Cairo. From there, they headed to Beirut. Interestingly, while flying over the Mediterranean, the small formation tried to stay as far away from the eastern coast as possible. They simply did not want to risk it. They feared an unpredictable response from the newly formed Israeli Air Force. From there, the route continued through Damascus and Baghdad. Finally, they reached Tehran. In the Iranian capital, the British put on two major flight demonstrations. The second one was flown specifically for Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Iranian ruler was an experienced pilot himself. He was extremely interested in the new jet. He started heavily pressuring his guests to let him fly it himself. However, the British just could not risk it. They could not let a foreign head of state fly solo in a completely unfamiliar jet. From Iran, the delegation headed home. But during the flight to Baghdad, a serious issue arose. The fighter suddenly lost its centerline drop tank. Mike Lithgow was forced to make an emergency landing. He was dangerously low on fuel. They could only source a replacement tank in Athens. Getting there meant relying entirely on the meager capacity of the internal tanks. This required unscheduled fuel stops in Ankara and Damascus. From Greece, the British were supposed to fly straight home. But they unexpectedly received an invitation to Rome. Truth be told, the Italians were not interested in the Attacker at all. They were actually looking at its accompanying support aircraft. After the visit to Italy, the fighter finally set course for Britain. It soon landed safely back home. A long journey of just over 8,000 miles was now behind them. From a technical standpoint, the tour went almost perfectly. Aside from losing the drop tank and a minor hydraulic pump failure, the aircraft proved incredibly reliable. It was an undeniable triumph for the engineers. But commercially, the massive undertaking was a complete failure. Not a single country visited by the delegation ended up placing an order. This was true even though the Turkish government had seriously considered buying 72 airframes at one point. In the summer of 1951, the first production attackers began entering service. They joined the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm Squadrons. Pilots immediately started developing tactics for a wide variety of combat scenarios. During the summer of 1954, for example, pilots practiced dive bombing and firing unguided rockets. During these exercises, aircrews openly complained about two main issues. The dive brakes were much less effective than expected. Also, cockpit visibility was simply too poor for combat engagements. Despite this, the aircraft pressed on. It remained in frontline service with some units right up until early 1956. In August 1951, the first operational combat squadron equipped exclusively with the Attacker was formed. It boasted a complement of 8 jets. Heading into winter, a second identical squadron was stood up. Together, these two units made history. They became the Royal Navy's first all-jet carrier strike group. In early spring 1952, one of the squadrons deployed aboard the newly commissioned aircraft carrier HMS Eagle. They went for intensive combat workups. For almost a month, the massive ship cruised the rough waters of the English Channel. During this time, the fighters completed over 100 deck launches. They logged 72 flight hours. They often flew in less than ideal weather conditions. The aircraft took an active part in a series of fleet exercises. One jet even successfully simulated an incoming enemy anti-ship missile. By early summer, the second squadron arrived aboard the same carrier, but on their final day at sea, tragedy struck. Right after taking off heavy, the fighter flown by Lieutenant Chandler suddenly caught fire and plunged into the sea. Fortunately, the pilot was quickly rescued. But following the incident, command immediately suspended all attacker carrier operations pending an investigation. The detailed inquiry took just over a week. Experts reached an unexpected conclusion. The crash was caused by an excessively high concentration of sulfur in the jet fuel. Because of this critical issue, every single fighter that had operated from the deck of HMS Eagle was urgently pulled in for unscheduled heavy maintenance. In January 1952, the Royal Navy formed 890 Squadron. They received their aircraft from 800 Squadron. This squadron was transitioning to the newer FB-1 variant at the time. However, getting their initial operations off the ground was far from easy. The attackers of the new squadron began showing widespread and serious issues with their fuel systems. The situation got so critical that there were days when the entire squadron was completely grounded. These technical faults were finally ironed out toward the beginning of summer. After that, things improved. They even formed a 4-ship aerobatic team within the squadron. By July of that same year, the squadron deployed for a brief stint aboard the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious. Between April and July 1952, 800 and 890 squadrons began re-equipping with the FB-1 and FB-2 variants. However, 890 Squadron did not last long. It was disbanded on December 3rd. All aircrews and maintenance personnel were reassigned to the 2 remaining units. This allowed the number of aircraft in each squadron to be brought up to the standard complement of 12. You would expect a boost in combat effectiveness, but the actual operational readiness of the squadrons barely improved. The main reason was that most of the attackers sat idle in the hangar. They were plagued by constant maintenance issues. In early 1953, both squadrons fully transitioned to the upgraded FB-2. Soon after, 803 Squadron also formed its own aerobatic team. The pilots started rushing their airshow workups. Unfortunately, pushing through training so aggressively led to tragedy. On May 19th, at roughly 4,000 feet, 2 aircraft collided in mid-air. Both pilots were killed. Later that same year, these 2 squadrons deployed twice to the Mediterranean Sea aboard the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle. They returned for another Mediterranean deployment from February 3rd to May 26, 1954. It was during this lengthy cruise that the attacker really showed its flaws. The airframes proved so temperamental that the jets spent a lot more time down for maintenance than up in the air. Maintainers struggled to keep more than 2 aircraft airworthy at any given time. This abysmal deployment record sealed the fate of the fighter. On June 11th, 800 Squadron was disbanded. 4 months later, 803 Squadron transitioned to the much more capable and reliable Seahawk. From April 25th, 1955, through March 10th, 1957, over 80 FB-2s flew with 5 squadrons of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. This is where reservist pilots who had previously only flown older piston-engine aircraft transitioned to jets. However, when this reserve branch was eventually disbanded, the days of the attacker in Royal Navy service were officially numbered. In 1958, nearly all existing attackers were scrapped. Only a single F-1 airframe survives today. This historic aircraft is now on display at the Fleet Air Arm Museum in Yeovilton, England. It's no secret that Royal Navy pilots openly disliked the attacker. They even gave it the rather fitting nickname of the disgusting aircraft. One of the main reasons for this attitude was its ground handling. Pilots had spent years flying piston-engine fighters. In those planes, the rudder caught plenty of prop wash. Because of this, they had a really hard time getting the hang of taxiing a jet. On top of that, the designer's decision to reuse the old wing from the Spiteful fighter drew harsh criticism. Because of this aerodynamic design, transonic handling issues kicked in at just Mach 0.76. For comparison, the contemporary Meteor fighter had a much higher critical Mach number. It was up around Mach 0.82. Commander John Henry Nethersole logged plenty of flight hours in the attacker. He recalled his experience with the fighter. He noted that without a drop tank, it was a perfectly capable aircraft for aerobatics. However, it desperately lacked speed. As soon as the airspeed hit Mach 0.76, compressibility effects kicked in hard. At point, the pilot would completely lose elevator control. The heavy jet would then inevitably pitch down into a dangerous dive. There was another absurd quirk. If the aircraft was flying with an external drop tank, the only way the pilot knew it was empty was by watching the fuel gauge for the main internal tank. This main tank held 73 imperial gallons. When its gauge started dropping rapidly, the pilot knew the drop tank was empty. The Attacker's fuel system was incredibly unreliable in its own right. On top of that, the wing-mounted guns were positioned very poorly. You could only hit a target with a maximum of 3 guns at a time. This seriously reduced its combat effectiveness. But while the pilots merely disliked the aircraft, the ground crews and maintainers absolutely hated it. For example, just to access the engine for basic maintenance, the jet first had to be jacked high up. Only then could you remove the massive, heavy upper fuselage panel. It was a tedious and time-consuming procedure that ate up a ton of valuable time. Despite all its flaws, there were still pilots who genuinely liked the Attacker for some of its handling characteristics. Regardless, the aircraft's real historical value has nothing to do with its combat record. For the Royal Navy, it served as an essential bridge. It connected the piston engine era with the dawn of the jet age. The only country that actually decided to buy the Attacker was Pakistan. Their Air Force was still in its infancy at the time. Their top priority was getting equipped with jet aircraft. In 1949, a major contract was signed to deliver 36 of these fighters. These were the land-based versions with non-folding wings. They were powered by reliable Nene 3 engines, putting out 5,100 pounds of thrust. Compared to the original British fighters, the Pakistani jets were noticeably lighter and much easier to handle. This major export order was fulfilled at the South Marston plant. From there, the brand new Attackers were ferried straight to the customer. The Pakistan story would not be complete without the very first prototype of this aircraft. It somehow seemed to show up everywhere. The plan was to officially debut it at a massive parade. This event celebrated the country's Independence Day on August 14, 1950. Veteran test pilot Dave Morgan was at the controls. He set out on the long ferry flight with plenty of time to spare. He departed on August 4th. At first, everything went smoothly. But on August 7th, during a stopover in Baghdad, the aircraft's left main gear strut suddenly collapsed. The incident ended up damaging the drop tank and the left wing tip. With the schedule in jeopardy, they urgently called in a maintenance team from England. A Valletta transport arrived right on time. It brought in the company's top technicians. They worked around the clock. They had the Attacker fully repaired by August 12th. After that, Morgan resumed the ferry flight. Even with a long way still to go to Karachi, he arrived right as the parade was kicking off. He managed to join the formation directly from his route, and even ended up leading the flyover. The production fighters also flew to Pakistan under their own power. To make the trip, they were fitted with extra drop tanks. They cruised at an optimal altitude of nearly 39,000 feet. The average leg between fuel stops was about 580 nautical miles. Flying this demanding route took the pilots a solid week. Deliveries began in June 1951. They continued through May 1953. It is worth noting that every single Attacker was delivered in perfect condition. There was not a single major snag. Once in Pakistan, the aircraft entered service with No. 11 Squadron. The squadron was based at the sprawling Faisal Air Base on the outskirts of Karachi. This was the nation's capital at the time. There, the Attackers flew critical missions as dedicated interceptors. The first pilots transitioning to these new jets put an incredible amount of effort into mastering them. Their hard work paid off. They even managed to fly in the next Independence Day parade, putting on a seriously impressive formation aerobatics display. However, during routine flight ops, the Pakistani Air Force ran into the exact same technical issues as the British. But here, the situation was further complicated by infrastructure limitations. The country was still developing. It did not exactly have the ideal facilities to support early jet fighters. Because of this, the fleet suffered a significant number of major mishaps and hull losses. So it is no surprise that when the first, far more reliable F-86 Sabres arrived in January 1956, a decision was made. The Air Force immediately transitioned No. 11 Squadron to the American jets. Even so, the attackers were not instantly sent to the boneyard. They were still actively flown. However, they were shifted to a fighter-bomber role until more capable aircraft could take their place. By the early 60s, the vast majority of the Pakistani attackers were phased out. The last of the airframes actually managed to stay in service all the way until 1964. Looking back, the attacker's story serves as a perfect example of how decades of engineering experience can actually backfire when developing a fundamentally new aircraft. The rapid transition into the jet age demanded equally radical changes in airframe design. The old philosophy of simply adapting a successful legacy airframe was combined with traditional British conservatism. This proved completely incompatible with the new realities of jet aviation. Ultimately, it was this very aircraft that marked a turning point. It began the slow but inevitable decline of the brilliant yet surprisingly short-lived legacy of the legendary Supermarine Aircraft Company.